Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And I'm Dr. Hinson.
And we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. Welcome to the recap and analysis of Handmaid's Tale Season 1, Episode 4, titled A Long Latin Thing I Don't Know How to Say.
I don't know how to pronounce it. Yeah, nobody make me pronounce it. No, Latin is not my thing.
Don't Let the Bastards Get You Down is...
the translation.
Yeah. So it's the one with Offred in the closet. And how does she get in the closet? Well, she gets in the closet from last episode when she was banished to her room. She finds that Latin phrase, Nolite Te Bastardes Carborundorum.
Carborundorum. That's the one I can say. Carborundorum.
Carborundorum. Scratched discreetly into the wall inside the closet. So at one point, the housekeeper finds Offred lying on the closet floor, and Offred lies that she's fainted. I don't know why we can't lay where we want to. Okay, sure. But Serena sends Offred to the hospital for a checkup. And this is where we find out that the commander is most likely sterile.
Yeah.
This is also common.
Yeah. Well, infertility is rampant.
So then the guy who, Christian Brune from Orphan Black.
Right, exactly.
One of the clones' husbands, offers to, as the nurse, as the doctor in the hospital, offers to impregnate Offred, which evidently is also common.
Something that happens. Yeah, something that happens.
So we know that this is not, it's weird to Offred, but it's not weird to the system around Gilead that this might need to happen. Mm-hmm. So in flashbacks, we're back at the Rachel and Leah Center. We learn about the ceremony. We learn about that. And then we also learn that during the Rachel and Leah Center, June and Moira made a run for it. And Moira gets out, and June does not. Mm-hmm. June is punished by having her feet whipped. I'm going to guess because she ran on them. Sure.
Who knows with Gilead?
Yeah. So there's another ceremony that night. Once again, the commander can't perform, but can perform during a game of Scrabble, which he also has again with Offred that night. Mm-hmm. And then she asks him about the previous Offred. And we are told that Offred committed suicide because life was so unbearable.
Which I'm sure suicide rates in Gilead have to be very high.
I'm sure they're not even tracking them, to be completely frank. But yeah.
Why would they?
Yeah. But then he releases Offred from the solitary confinement. Mm-hmm. So in a way, this is an episode in which, like, nothing happens, but it is setting up. This is kind of a pivotal point in June, reclaiming June and understanding her role in the wider waking up of the Gilead resistance. Yes. So
very rich. And I think there was a lot of symbolism that maybe alludes to what we're going to see later on in the episodes for this season. But going from the end of the last episode, we learn in this one that Offglen has had her clitoris removed, so that she, quote, cannot want what she cannot have. Thanks very much, Gilead. I was super nervous about where they were going to go with this episode. So the episode opens, as we saw, with Offred in her room. All the human contact and quote-unquote normal elements of her new routine have been removed. And as each day passes, we get to watch, because there's this wonderful voyeurism that we have in this particular series, as she truly becomes a prisoner. Even more importantly, from my perspective, she becomes a prisoner of the memories of the past, especially when she is prevented from making any new memories by engaging with society. Even if she hates where she is now, she still formed some kind of relationship with Offglen before she was taken away. So she's removed, she's just literally trapped by the past. And it was really extraordinarily convincing depiction, I thought, for how humans suffer with the loss of autonomy and freedom, even when the new routine of her imprisoned lifestyle is disrupted. And we've returned again to the idea of fertility and sterility, which are our favorite topics. And I have in my notes from this episode that Old Testament scripture, as we know, they don't care for the New Testament in our Gilead, is being used to justify this sacred ceremony, and we get to see like the foundations of that. And we learn that male sterility not spoken of, and that the word is in fact forbidden on this list of things that are forbidden in society. You can't even talk about the potential that a man could be impotent. So I don't know if you want to start by unpacking some of that religious language that they use, or how hard it was to watch June go through that emotional turmoil of being locked in her room. Like, Moss really worked hard for that Emmy in some of these episodes, and she pretty much secured it with those scenes in the closet.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure no one is going to be surprised to discover that I find Gilead's interpretation of the role of Bilhah, the handmaid, to be incorrect.
What? Shocking.
So let me unpack this, but like instead of understanding the cultural context in which Rachel, Leah, Jacob, and Bilhah existed and why their choices were made, the founders of Gilead took a literal interpretation as a commandment for future action, which is dumb.
Not a good idea.
Just dumb.
Not a good pattern.
So common wisdom among biblical scholars and Hebraic scholars is that the Old Testament books and the Torah were not meant for that purpose. They were instead to provide guidances through stories so that we can understand the character of God and engage critical thinking skills. So I someone needs to unpack Jacob, Leah, Rachel. So let me do that. So this is a soap opera trope come to life. I'm not entirely sure why we don't mind some of the Bible more for our like bonk busters, because they really are. So this takes place in Genesis chapter 29. So Jacob was in love with Rachel, and he is so in love with her that like dude is just walking down the road, sees her, and is like, I must have her.
No.
Like, so like love, lust, little confused, but like Rachel's, you know, the shit. And Jacob wants her. Yeah. So he works for years in her father's field to earn the favor to marry Rachel. Years. And then on the wedding night, unbeknownst to Jacob, Rachel and Leah's dad switches them out, and he actually gets married to Leah.
Oh, snap.
Yeah. So clearly no one is happy about this. Leah has resigned herself because Leah is the true hero of this story. But Jacob works for even longer for the right to marry Rachel. And he eventually does. So he's now married to 2 sisters.
He was.
And every time I read this story, and I've preached this and I've studied this, like I just want to crawl back through time and hug Leah and tell her like, homegirl, I am just like, you are going to be praised by your descendants, but like, this is just crap.
Yeah.
So what's relevant to Gilead picks up in verse 31 of that chapter, where we find out that God gave Leah sons because she was not loved. So she has 4 sons and Rachel has none. Rachel's jealousy consumes her, and she lashes out at Jacob, who reminds her that he has no control over her fertility. So Rachel decides that someone has to have control over fertility. So Rachel's going to have control. And she makes Jacob marry her handmaid, Bilhah. So Jacob and Bilhah have 2 kids that are credited to Rachel.
It's all making sense now.
Then there are a few more kids. And then finally, Rachel gives birth to Joseph, who you know as the owner of the magical Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Yeah.
And he was totally spoiled rotten because he was Rachel's.
Like actual progeny.
So this is essentially a story of jealousy and mourning and polygamy and an agricultural culture that needed sons.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite little details is that it's Leah who is remembered in history. So there are only 5 women who are named in the genealogy of Jesus that the book of Matthew presents in chapter 1, and Leah's one of them.
Nice.
So like, girl got hers.
Yeah.
But like, Rachel's a cow. And she's a cow for very culturally valid reasons, but still, like, there is no sister love that we see at all. They don't care about each other at all. And Leah is just talked about as this faithful woman who keeps her mouth shut. So all the physicality of how Gilead does this ceremony dehumanizes it even more than the biblical narrative.
Yeah.
And since we're like, and then it dehumanizes the act of sex itself, since in theological language, if we're told that God created a humanity, the pleasure centers activated during sex are created intentionally as well. And there's a relatively easy biblical argument to make that I have made many times, that if sex is not pleasurable for both parties involved, it's not actually fulfilling its biblical purpose. So this world is entirely devoid of pleasure, however, even for men.
Yeah.
And I was really glad that they did create that bit where the commander couldn't perform, because I was wondering like how, like, what happened. But I love this idea that he can't have sex with someone he isn't attracted to. Like, I love this dichotomy.
Or doesn't have intimacy with.
Yeah, he can't do it.
There's no emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so he can't make it work. Yeah. Yep. Fascinating. So, preach, Pastor Kristen, first. Thank you for that necessary context. I remember the first time you explained this to me, I was like, oh my gosh, all of what is happening makes sense. And I think it's fascinating that in this scenario in Gilead, they are equating, I mean, I know they're called the Rachel and Leah centers, but the ceremony—
Rachel and Bilhah, yeah.
The ceremony itself is Rachel and Bilhah, and Rachel is the elevated one. The wives are Rachel's. They're not called Rachel's, but they could be in this scenario. Mm-hmm. Which is fascinating because that's, again, subverting the kind of the tradition within Christianity, which is fascinating. I think the invention of an emotional relationship with Waterford's handmaid is entirely about his difficulty performing during the ceremony. He's like, this is not working. He's got pressure to produce children for Gilead, especially as in elevated. We don't really know what other men do. Are all men commanders? Are all men in the military or politics? We're not really sure because we only get the lens of this part of Gilead. They all have to be celibate because they're not in state-sanctioned relationships. I don't know. So we learn more about this sterility. And the super scary scene where our friend from Orphan Black is like,
but he's like super jolly about it. He like peeks around the corner. He's like, hey, I can do this for you. It's like,
hey, you want a baby? I can make a baby. Like he's doing it out of kindness. It's just one of those things, like it's the same thing about taking away jobs where I'm just like, I can't fathom that scenario actually happening. So we're not sure if the commander is sterile or just so dehumanized that he can't ejaculate. We don't know. It's a question. Well, another joyous question we are left with in this show. And it's fascinating to me that through this need to reestablish the emotional dynamics that Gilead has taken away, he is humanizing, like reanimating, individualizing. So a big part of control and confinement is de-individualizing people, which they do remarkably well in Gilead.
It's a gift.
It's a gift. They really thought that one through. But he is individualizing both himself, humanizing both himself and Offred, which is really, really fascinating. And I know a lot of this episode was just right in the Dr. Donnelly wheelhouse. But what struck me from an imprisonment and resistance standpoint was the representation of communal and shared experiences and the bond that this creates with the imprisoned. So this concept frames the episode through Offred's discovery of the Latin inscription in her bedroom closet, like referencing that handmaid before her, and where she is connected emotionally to that woman through her act of resistance, because we learn that handmaids aren't allowed to read or write. So even scraping that little thing on the wall was a massive part of the resistance. And we also see it in our flashbacks in the way that the handmaids steal food for Offred when she is whipped and can't get up or is confined to bed, whatever, after she's punished for escaping with Moira. And it's this unification through really small acts when you look at them in the big scheme of Gilead, that empowers Offred to continue her efforts with the commander and kind of gives her the motivation to keep chinking away at this armor. And I'm sure we'll lead her into the further episodes as we develop. What was your reaction to those small scenes of resistance?
So this is where, dear listeners, when I told Dr. Hinson my theory of the food was, I think it took her a little while to go there with me because it's a little bit out there. But
you know that gif of like, there's a million gifs, but the gif of like mind blown. I'm thinking like the Anna Kendrick one where she's just like,
and this is one of those things where like we talk a little bit in the second season about how they do things because they're super clever, and I don't know if they know where they're going.
Writers,
if anyone in the show ever tells me this was an intentional allegory, I will probably eat a hat, because I don't think they even knew what they were doing here. But food is a huge part of Christianity. Massive. If you are not somebody who is, in the faith tradition, was raised in the faith tradition, if you just kind of understand it from television, let me unpack why one of the ways that food is so important. So one of the core traditions in nearly every stream of Christianity is communion. You can call it Eucharist, you can call it Lord's Supper, whatever. It's the ceremonial remembrance of Jesus's last meal with his disciples on the night that he was betrayed and the night before he was killed. So for me, his commandment to break bread and drink wine together in remembrance of him, which is what he says that night in the Gospels, is really, really core to the faith. You can't really understand Christianity without understanding that idea of remembrance and food. Yeah. And my best theology is worked out with food and around tables and over meals. And as we break bread, I think there is something incredibly sacred about eating food with people. You are vulnerable when you're eating. We know that from like even science and biology. You're at your most vulnerable when you're eating because you're totally consumed. And emotionally, I don't know about you, but it's like, this is why like first dates over food are always the most awkward, because food is intimate and you're not intimate on first dates. So it's very, very, it's very intense. So food is essential, as we know, both emotionally and physically, but it's also, so is community. Community is essential to human beings. We are communal creatures. So that final meal that Jesus had the night before he was going to be killed as a political prisoner of the Roman state, remember that. He wasn't just a guy. He was going to be killed as a political prisoner. Yeah. He was already a rabble rouser. So when the four Gospels were written between 33 AD and 90 AD, Christianity was still illegal. That's really important to remember anytime you're talking about scripture too. So one interpretation of Jesus's request that we remember him at meals is that we remember the resistance. We remember that we stood up to empire and that Caesar is not a god and is certainly not anybody that we should worship. And so every time we get together, and in 33 to 90 AD, that was under punishment of death, you should break bread, you should rest together, you should have a meal and remember the resistance. So as Christianity became the legal religion with Constantine in the 300s-ish, 400s-ish, yeah. This interpretation got lost for sure. We don't talk about the fact that we used to resist empire anymore. So when we moved from being the outcast to being in power, we weren't resisting anything. So I would imagine that most Christians these days even forget the oppression and politics of the Roman Empire, and they certainly fail to see the similarities between Rome and, say, America and Gilead. But in a theocracy like Gilead, the countercultural, incarnational, political radical who was executed for saying that Caesar wasn't God and we really should all love each other equally, is back in his rightful interpretive place. That's the Jesus if we interpret the Gospels culturally. Yeah. So he's placed there with the handmaids and their resistance by breaking bread and remembering and being together and communal in this tiny act of remembrance. I could be totally off, but that's what it said to me. So this because bonds forged in resistance are let no man put asunder.
Yeah.
So I'll be watching closely those handmaids and how I would imagine that one of the very important things for the state of Gilead is to make sure that the handmaids are never friends.
Right.
And that there is no leader among the handmaids.
Yeah, because collectivity
is power.
And particularly in resistance and finding that common bond of humanity. But I think that's so fascinating, especially because I know you've talked about a lot already how Jesus is not a part of the theocracy. And we don't get a reference to Jesus. In real time, 2018, as we're recording this, we're into season 2 and nobody's talking about Jesus. God, but not Jesus. And their God is very, very different from the gods. Well, not all the gods, but certainly the Jesus end of the bit in the Bible. See, that was the technical term that I used there.
The member of the Trinity that is Jesus. You're good.
The Jesus bit of Christianity, says the agnostic.
You're fine.
But I think, call me Captain Obvious here, but I feel like resistance is to systemic oppression is something they're trying to get us to focus on here.
Probably.
And is going to be central to the series. So I think that's a great point to end on. Previous to Dr. Donnelly opening my eyes to this, I had never made the connection between communion and resistance. I had taken some origins of Christianity classes in college, but they went into more like the foundations of the governments or of the religion. So I knew that it wasn't popular. I knew that it was illegal, but we didn't go that theological step in talking about communion. So that's fascinating. And also another notch in my favorite argument to make on the importance of historical context. So we'll end there and roll on to episode 5. I'm Dr. Hinson.
I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research, and we'll see you next episode.
Bye.